This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Mitch Maglio. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics talking about comics.
That's right. And on this interview episode, I have the pleasure of talking with Mitch Maglio. His new book, Fiction House, From Pulps to Panels, From Jungles to Space, has recently come out from IDW and Yoe Books. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Yeah, you'll find great discounts on bundles of comics, and you'll find discounts on books like the one that we're going to be talking today with Mitch Maglio about. Fiction House, From Pulps to Panels, is available at dcbservice.com at 35% off the cover price, $32.49. You can also find great discounts on other Yoe Books at Discount Comic Book Service. They have Ghosts and Girls of Fiction House, which is another great Yoe book that you may want to check out if you're interested in this conversation at awesome discounts. So, as always, you'll find incredible deals at Discount Comic Book Service.
That's right. Definitely go to their website, dcbservice.com, because they will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Please let them know.
Paul, I had a really good time talking with Mitch Maglio about his new book, Fiction House, From Pulps to Panels, From Jungles to Space. I'm sorry you couldn't join us for the conversation, but I mean, Mitch was really a big storage house of information when it comes to not only the kind of comics that Fiction House put out back during the Golden Age, but also the genesis of the publisher and its origins as a publisher of pulps, and then getting into comics and really making their mark.
Yeah, it sounds super fascinating, and I can't wait to hear it. I love that here at the Comics Alternative, we talk about present-day comics. We also get to get into a lot of the historical stuff, so this is going to be fun.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and give that conversation a listen. I'm pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Mitch Maglio. He is the author of a new book, Fiction House, From Pulps to Panels, From Jungles to Space, that's coming out from IDW and Yoe Books. Mitch, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
Yeah.
How are you today, Derek?
I'm doing really well. I was excited to see this book solicited a few months ago because I know that Craig Yoe has done some previous stuff, like reprinting older Fiction House material. Yours, though, not only includes original works, even black and white art from collectors and auction houses, which I want to talk about, but you also include quite an extensive history of Fiction House in this book. So it is, I would say, the go-to text for anyone who wants to find out and even learn for the first time about the publishing house, Fiction House. So tell us, for those who may not be familiar with the pulp and comics publisher Fiction House, give us a brief overview of their history.
Well, Fiction House started out as a pulp magazine a publisher in 1922. A fellow by the name of John Glenister, who was a remarkable character, and we talk about him in the book at some length, was the founder of the company. And they were quite successful, right up until comic books hit. And then they were approached by Will Eisner and Jerry Iger, who had the famous Eisner-Iger shop, about getting into comic books. This was a little before Action Comics hit. And Eisner and Iger had been doing some things for a British publication called Wags. And so at the time, the president of the company, Thurman Scott, decided to take a flyer on it, and they came out with the first issue of Jumbo Comics, which featured Sheena. And the rest, as they say, is kind of history. I mean, from there on, Fiction House had two lines, pulp magazines and comic books. During the Golden Age, Fiction House was actually the third largest publisher of comics, right behind DC and Fawcett.
Mm-hmm. And you were talking about Jumbo Comics, but you spend quite a bit of time not only covering that title, but the other five in what's considered the Big Six, right?
That's correct. In very short order, they were so popular where Jumbo was concerned that in very short order they came out with other titles: Fight Comics, Planet Comics, Rangers, Wings, and Jungle, and they constituted the Big Six. Those titles ran until 1954. And they employed some of the biggest artists in comic book history. I mean, Jack Kirby did early Jumbo work. Guys like Matt Baker, who was the foremost good girl artist in comics history, and also one of the first African Americans to work in the comic business. Many women like Lily Renee and Fran Hopper were house artists for Fiction House, and they produced a very high quality of artwork, and the books were very popular for 15 years.
You mentioned the female artists who worked for Fiction House, and one of the things I found impressive about this book is there's a chapter in your introductory historical overview called The Women of Fiction House. And for those who may be familiar with Fiction House, they may see that title and think, oh, okay, so this is going to be a chapter on the good girl art. But you quickly pivot to emphasize the female creators, the artists who really helped to give Fiction House its stamp, its recognizable Fiction House style and look. And you spend quite a bit of time in this chapter discussing a variety of these female artists. And then there's another chapter after that called Additional Artists' Biographies, where I guess all male, and you include brief biographies of who these were. Now, on the one hand, these brief biographies of the male artists is kind of understandable because many of these names, like Eisner, Lou Fiennes, people already know, right? Jack Kirby, but they may not know the female creators. But I think it's quite impressive that you spend significantly more page space discussing these female artists instead of the male artists.
Well, here's the thing. Back in those times, we're talking World War II era. Mm-hmm. For women to break into any industry was extremely difficult. So these ladies had a tremendous amount of intestinal fortitude to break into really what was an all-boys club. The artist studios at that time were like a bullpen and it could get pretty raw. Young men, you know how they are. Mm-hmm. And so these women walked into this environment, and they were able to flourish. They brought their own sensibilities to, how they treated women. I mean, some of these women were the best good girl artists at Fiction House. Fran Hopper and Lily Renee are renowned good girl artists. And when you look at their artwork, you see how respectfully they treated women. They also tended to avoid in their artwork racial stereotypes. And if you hold Fiction House comics up to other comic books of the period, even DC and Timely, you'll see that in Fiction House books, the depictions of African Americans, even the Japanese who we were at war with, are less racially charged than what you would find in the other companies. Mm-hmm. And I think that the women brought that sensibility there as well. One woman in particular, Ruth Roche, who really was Jerry Iger's partner in his studio, and the studio is known on the letterhead as the Iger-Roche Studio, produced about 60% of all the artwork that appeared in Fiction House comics. So Ruth had a lot of script input. She did a lot of writing, uncredited writing, on Sheena in particular, but certainly on the Kanga and Jungle comics, and just across the board. Many of the plot summaries were created by Ruth, and another woman, Tony Bloom, also did a lot of writing for Fiction House. And Tony was the daughter of Alex Bloom, mm-hmm. who is, I'm sure you know, he's a legendary artist in his own right. And so the women, their impact on Fiction House, I don't think you can overstate it.
Yeah, and, you mentioned the Iger shop, and before that, the Eisner and Iger shop. You do point out throughout the text that much of the material that appeared in the Fiction House titles came from various shops, specifically, Eisner, Iger. And there's some female creators like Roche, like Bloom, who did work with those shops. But you also mm-hmm. point out that many of these female artists were in-house creators at Fiction House. So Fiction House was creating and nurturing their own women artists.
Yeah, that's very true. As Fiction House got more successful, Thurman Scott, who by this time was the president of the company, decided he wanted to build his own stable of artists. And the story goes actually that he was in town to interview artists, and Lily Renee walked in and sat down among this whole group of men, and Thurman Scott walked out, saw her, and he brought her into to his office, and she showed him some sketches that she had done, and he hired her on the spot. So these guys, the gentlemen that were running Fiction House were very much ahead of their time. They pursued Matt Baker, and Matt worked at various times. He worked for the Iger shop. He worked directly for Fiction House for about 5 years, and then he did some freelance for Fiction House later on. So they had a sort of menagerie of sources for their artwork. Mm.
Now, you mentioned Thurman Scott. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't he really want the final say, very hands-on when it came to the covers, and not only the comics, but also the pulps? And he specifically wanted to make sure that the covers had that appealing aspect to potential readers, whether they be younger or older, of good girl art.
Yeah, T.T. Scott, he was an interesting guy. He actually was married to Glenister's daughter, which was how he came into the company. And when John passed away, he took over the company and moved to his farm in Georgia. And he from that location, he managed every cover, every Fiction House cover for virtually the entire run. And he was very much of the opinion that comics were sold by the cover. So he really pushed the good girl art, and what they would do is they would send out the sketches to him by train, and so he would get them the next day. He would mark up the covers with suggestions that weren't really suggestions; they were more marching orders, and the artists would finish them up. But he had final approval on every cover, both pulps and comics, for close to 15 years.
You know, you also point out in your historical overview that the house in the 1950s tended to target fiction house as unhealthy for young readers, specifically because of the good girl art. And I guess that people who aren't familiar with fiction house, who maybe just recognize the covers and know some of the interior art, would think that this is a publisher that primarily exploited the female form. But you go out of your way, you know, as does someone that you cite a variety of times in your overview, Trina Robbins, that it wasn't just the visuals, the good girl art, so to speak, but it was much more important that women were much more empowered in these stories.
Yeah, you know, a lot of things about Fiction House made when they were doing the House Committee on Juvenile Delinquency that targeted comic books. It made them nervous. Female empowerment made them nervous. Female sexuality made them nervous. Of course, they were very nervous about horror, which is why they targeted EC. And we were in a very politically charged time in the mid-'50s when there was quite a lot of censorship going on. And, of course, you know, the infamous book Seduction of the Innocent kind of put a lot of charge on that. But more than that, the Hartford Courant at the time ran a 4-day anti-comics crusade in their newspapers, a series of articles that targeted comic books in general and Fiction House and EC in particular. And those articles were picked up internationally by news services everywhere. And it really started a grassroots kind of anti-comic crusade. And that led to the Committee on Juvenile Delinquency and ultimately to the Comics Code. And once the Comics Code came into effect, I mean, Fiction House really could not survive that. And a number of publishers went out of business because it basically, you know, took away their ability to create comics the way they had been creating them.
You know, I'm glad that not only here in this interview you're talking about the House Committee, but you also mentioned in your book, a lot of people think that this kind of censorship, the main target of that was EC Comics because they're the most visible, right? People always refer to William Gaines and what he and his new trend line suffered as a result of all of that paranoia. But, you know, you make it clear in your book on Fiction House that they suffered as well, and the committee ultimately contributed to the demise of Fiction House, although, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that the various titles that Fiction House was putting out died kind of a slower, less public or less visible death than the EC titles.
Yes, you know, very much so, because, you know, by that time, Thurman Scott, he saw the handwriting on the wall. He knew that he still had his pulp line that went on for several more years. And, of course, the Sheena property was still bringing in money for them. So he simply, you know, crunched the numbers and said, you know, I'm going to start to phase things out. And so he kind of got ahead of the curve on that. You know, even companies like DC were targeted by the committee. You know, I mean, Superman was held up as a fascist, and Batman was held up as a latent homosexual. They put an enormous amount of pressure across the industry.
Now, one of the things that defined many of the fiction house titles, especially those in the Big Six, were, I guess, the multi-genre coverage, right? So you had a title like, I mean, obviously, Jungle Comics that dealt primarily with jungle stories, which now doesn't sound, I mean, maybe younger listeners will think, who wouldn't want to read stories of jungle comics? But, as you point out, this was quite a popular genre, a number of decades ago.
Huge.
Yeah, their title fight stories dealt with a lot of boxing narratives or included protagonists who were fighters in one form or another. Wings, aviation, and even though these various titles didn't exclusively publish stories that had something to do with that particular genre, it seems that, maybe with the exception of Rangers Comics, that the other titles in the Big Six were primarily genre-driven. Is that the case?
Oh, yes, absolutely. When you look at, with the exception of Jumbo, which really had a wide variety of genres that it did. I mean, Jumbo had everything from comedy to action, heavy adventure strips. A couple, my favorite strip in Jumbo was Sky Girl, which was a slapstick comedy that Matt Baker did for over 5 years. But the other titles were very genre-driven. Planet, obviously, was science fiction. And that's, collectors today, that's the title that they focus on. Rangers was generally military. During the war, it was very, war story-oriented. Afterwards, it became more soldier of fortune-driven.
Okay.
And so on. So you're correct. They were the other companies they were jumping on the superhero craze. But Fiction House was using their pulp pedigree and basically bringing over what they were doing in the pulps into the comic book realm. On the pulp side, they had planet stories. They had jungle stories. They had Fight and Wings as pulp magazines. So they simply brought them over and did them as comic books.
One of the things I found really interesting, getting back to the jungle genre, is that not only did you have, obviously, a lot of jungle stories in Jungle Comics, but you also had these kind of tales in many of their other titles. So, for instance, in Fight Comics, there was Tiger Girl and Princess Vishnu. And then in Jumbo, of course, as you mentioned, you had Sheena. I mean, basically, she's the most recognizable figure. So it seems that the jungle story kind of permeated a wide range of Fiction House's titles.
Well, especially the Jungle Girl.
Yeah.
Because Sheena was so popular. And really, in a lot of ways, she was as influential a character as Superman. Because if you look at Golden Age comics across the board, there are dozens and dozens of Sheena knockoffs. I mean, you've got, of course, Fiction House did a bunch of them, but Fox had their own line of Jungle Girls as well. You had White Princess of the Jungle. You had Rula. Just up and down the line. So T.T. Scott, always, thinking about sales, said, well, if one Jungle Girl is good, a half a dozen will be better.
Yeah. So
he made sure that he had them in virtually every comic book. And it's, of course, tied into his mandate for good girl art. Mm-hmm. Fight Comics in particular, I believe Tiger Girl was on the cover uninterrupted for about 7 or 8 years. Every Fight cover had a Tiger Girl on it. And, of course, Jumbo, Sheena was featured on over 100 covers.
And then there's my favorite jungle heroine, Fletcher Hanks's Phantoma, because it's just really, really freaky.
Yeah. Phantoma has the distinction of being the very first superheroine in comics. She predates Wonder Woman by about a year. And she's the first female hero, even though Sheena came first, she's the first female hero with superpowers. She could be a shapeshifter. I mean, her powers changed almost issue to issue, but largely she was a shapeshifter, and she was very strong, and she commanded mystic powers, and so she's a watershed character.
You do point out in your book that the love and the popularity of Tarzan contributed to this jungle story craze, especially when it comes to female characters like Sheena. What else do you think contributed to this, let's say, early 20th century fascination with jungle stories? And then how it may, just petered out as we get later into the century, into contemporary times.
Well, that's actually very simple, and it all comes down to one person. That's Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Yeah.
When he wrote Tarzan of the Apes, he captured the imagination of the entire population. His books were published in all over the world, and also at that time, we were exploring parts of the world that we hadn't really gone into. We were just beginning to explore Africa. So there was a fascination about it in the general population. But it's very much Edgar Rice Burroughs who opened that up, and everybody was trying to find a way in. Now, when Will Eisner created Sheena, which was actually before they went to work for Fiction House, Sheena's first appearance was in Wags magazine. And I should say Eisner and Edgar, because they co-created the character along with Ruth Roche, who had input as well. They were looking for a way into the jungle genre, and one or the other, depending on who you believe in interviews, said, well, why don't we do a girl? And so Sheena was born out of that.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the book that there is a disagreement as to, I guess, not only who had the major hand in creating Sheena, but also where the name came from between Jerry Iger and Will Eisner. They have different stories, right?
Yeah, and I think, over the years that became something of a controversy, but the fact of the matter is these were very young men working in a collaborative environment. Basically making things up as they went along and throwing ideas out as quickly as they hit their head. So I'm sure that, both gentlemen, were being truthful in their statements as they remembered it. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that, the most likely explanation is they were sitting around a table throwing out ideas, and this is how it the result was Sheena.
Well, while we're on the topic of jungle stories, specifically Jungle Girls, let's talk a little bit about another book that you have coming out from Yoe Books in IDW next year, and that is Jungle Girls.
Yeah, Jungle Girls is going to cover the entire scope of the Sheena-inspired jungle queens, princesses, and girls about town that really were in many different publishers. I mean, Fox jumped wholeheartedly into the jungle genre, and Matt Baker did some of those, as well as Jack Kamen, another great good girl artist. So they were showing up everywhere, and we're doing a book similar to what we did with Fiction House, which is we're going to talk about the genre, we're going to talk about the various publishers and artists, and we're going to publish some great reprints as well. I think it's a genre that is a lot of fun, and we have fun with it. We point out the fact that these girls somehow, white blonde girls made their way into the jungle wearing not a lot, and their makeup and hair was always perfect.
Yeah. Well, what is it about the genre that has drawn you over the years to spend so much time, not only in the Fiction House book, but also in this upcoming Jungle Girls text?
Well, I think it's just such a fantasy genre. It's fun at the end of the day. It doesn't pretend to make deep statements about the world. They're good action adventure stories, and of course the girls are pretty. I mean, it's a love of good girl art, and there's really no better example of that art form than in the jungle genre. I should take a minute just to talk about good girl art in general, and that is that it's not about whether the girls were good or bad. It's a style of drawing women that emphasizes their beauty. It was one of the things that, of course, Frederick Wertham in the House seized upon. They were referred to as headlight arts at the time, but it's some of the very best art of the Golden Age. I believe was good girl art. So that's really what drove the decision to do that book.
And you provide ample examples throughout the book of not only covers but also interior art. And I mean, obviously, the good girl display, I guess, is apparent in the covers because that's what gets the reader's initial attention or the potential reader's attention. But in a lot of the interiors as well, you see these beautiful, shapely women in various stages of danger and adventure that are posed in such a way that, how can I say this, kind of accentuates their features.
Yes, yeah. that was the purpose. I mean, especially at Fiction House, the marching orders were to make sure that you had, at least one panel on every page that prominently featured a woman's legs, and posed her in an attractive manner. And that's why they broke, if you look at a lot of Fiction House books, they broke panels, much more so than, say, DC or Timely did, although Kirby always broke panels, where they were very structured into, the six-panel page. A Fiction House page with good girl art, that girl could, be drawn across 3 panels. And so it made for very lively-looking pages. Aside from the depiction of the women, it made the pages more dynamic.
Yeah. See, that's one of the ironies I love about these Fiction House stories, in that on the one hand, someone could say, oh, well, look at this good girl art, you're objectifying the women, but yet the stories themselves show the women characters, whether they are out-and-out superheroes or superhero-ish, or lucky by chance heroic in one form or another. I mean, many times they're saving the day, they're saving the men. In fact, there are a variety of covers where instead of seeing the women tied up and the men coming in to save them, it's the opposite.
It's the opposite. The Fiction House women and Jungle Girls in general, these were not damsels in distress. They were the more interesting characters. They were powerful. They were resourceful. There's one great Fiction House character called Firehair, so Western character who was adopted by a tribe of Indians after her father had been killed, and she, through her resources, rises to lead the entire tribe and keep them safe from the various bad elements in the Old West. So, the women of Fiction House are very powerful.
Was Firehair a title that appeared in Rangers comics?
That's correct.
Yeah. So what is it about Fiction House that drove you to do so much historical research? I mean, is this a publisher that you are particularly drawn to? Because you really do a deep dive in this publisher.
Well, once I became aware that Fiction House employed African Americans and women at a time that it wasn't being done generally, it really kind of caught my interest. We tend to look at history as being a very simple palette. In the 30s and 40s, it was strictly men, and they established the comic book genre, and that's the generally accepted narrative of early comic books. When you dive in, you find out it's a very different story. And because Fiction House was a place to go to find out about that story, that's what really drew me to it. And then during the course of it, I found out about John Glenister. And Glenister was this Horatio Alger kind of character who had been an Olympic-level swimmer. He was the only man to this day ever to survive swimming the Niagara Rapids, although, as he put it, he jumped in and hoped for the best. I don't know if you've ever been to Niagara, but you have to be crazy to jump into those waters. So he was he was very much like the characters in his comic books. He was like a soldier of fortune type of guy. He was an anti-prohibitionist. He looked like Teddy Roosevelt. He was he's a real character. So the more that I dove into it, the more fascinating the story became. And then, really by chance, I was able to get a hold of Thurman Scott's papers, all of his, all the stuff he had kept when he was at Fiction House. He had donated it to a university, and they were kind enough to scan all of it and send it to me. So I was able to get a real insight into how they did their day-to-day business.
Now, are you also a collector? I guess a collector in general of older comics, Golden Age in particular, but I guess Fiction House in particular. Oh
yeah, I'm a collector of comic books, and my wife threatens to throw me out every now and then. I think the last time I did an inventory, there were like 17,000 of them.
Jeez.
But yeah, I have a focus on old Fiction House and old DC comics. I'm a huge Superman fan.
Well, how much from your own collection did you include as excerpts in the book?
Oh, well, I scanned really every book that's scanned for this book is from my collection. All the reprints come from my collection.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because
now
I was
a lot
curious.
of the covers come from Heritage, and the as well as a lot of the original artwork. They come from Heritage, and that's noted within the book. And then we get to at the end of the book, we got very lucky. A fellow by the name of Sandy Plunkett had gotten a hold of cover roughs, pencil sketches that Joe Doolin had done when he was, really their number one cover artist. And he was kind enough to share them with us. They'd never been seen before. And quite frankly, they only survived by chance. And he was gracious enough to let us scan them and include them in the book, and in doing so, really preserve them so that now there's no chance that they'll be lost. So really want to make sure to thank him very much for his contribution to the book. It's amazing to see, because you see the process from sketch to final. So we've got all this great artwork from just these huge number of sources.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm looking at this back part, the art of Joseph Doolin, and there is a sketch of, I guess, what's a mock Planets or Planet Comics cover, and you have this octopus getting its tentacles on a woman who is completely naked.
Yeah, a lot of artists, not just at Fiction House, but a lot of artists in general, drew the women naked first and then drew the clothing on them because it was easier for them to draw it that way. A lot of them were very well trained artists using the techniques of the time, and they drew their characters nude. So that's why you see them see them that way in some of the cover ups.
Yeah, in fact, there's another one that I turned to in this section where you have a rough sketch of Ranger Comics number 27, where you have a woman tied to a post with Japanese soldiers surrounding her, and of course her shirt is open, showing her breasts naked. And then in the final cover, of course, her top is covered.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's really an amazing insight into the process. Matter of fact, I was looking at that at the same time you were talking about it. They're just and Doolin, of course, was he was really their number one cover artist for a very, very long time. It's interesting that Matt Baker didn't do any cover art for Fiction House, although he did cover art in the romance genre for many years. Possibly because he was turning out so many pages, not just for Fiction House, but for he was freelancing even when he was employed by Fiction House, that he probably didn't have time to do covers.
Yeah, and you have written elsewhere on Matt Baker. I think it came out last year. It Rhymes with Lust Revisited, the Noir of Matt Baker. You did the introduction to that book?
Yeah, we were able to get a hold of a beautiful copy of It Rhymes with Lust, which has not been seen by a lot of collectors, and was really the first graphic novel. And it's very much a film noir kind of story. And so I did the intro for that, and since then I've completed a study of the Matt Baker as a film noir artist, which Boardman Books is going to be putting out hopefully fairly soon, where we really get into talking about film noir as a genre and Matt Baker as really the perfect artist for that genre. Baker had a way, one of the keynotes of film noir is that women are very intelligent and strong and dangerous. Mm-hmm. And Baker had this enormous respect for women. If you look at the faces of the women that he drew, there's a tremendous amount of intelligence. And he was a great, everybody talks about the bodies he drew. He was a great artist of faces. And he made these women look, he brought all this expressiveness to their faces. So it made him a perfect film noir type of artist. And I think he was very influenced by the genre.
Now, this book that came out last year, It Rhymes with Lust Revisited, and I guess the subtitle, or at least the series subtitle, is The Noir of Matt Baker, Volume 1. So they're going to be more of these Matt Baker noir books in the future? Yeah,
the next volume is going to be called, actually, The Noir of Matt Baker, and that's when we're going to do a deep dive into everything he did that was related to it.
Oh, okay. We should mention, I guess, the structure of your Fiction House book, because, it begins with an introduction by Roy Thomas, which really does set the stage. Haynes Ware does the foreword, but then I guess the core of the history is the next several sections. And then you have, I guess, a chapter or a section devoted to each of the big six titles, where you include, 2 or 3 different stories, or at least parts of stories from those specific titles, whether it be Fight Comics, Planet Jumbo. But you also include covers and the unfinished black and white art.
That's correct.
Yeah, that you got from
and I tell you, one of the most fun parts of this project was actually going through and picking out the art to include. Because I think that especially for people who don't know Fiction House or have never been exposed to Fiction House, they're going to be blown away by the level of artwork that these people produced. Remember, they were working in a 4-color process. They were working on Bristol board. They had a limited palette to work with, and they turned out art that I think holds up very well today, against all the computer-generated palettes and the fact that they're working on high gloss paper as opposed to newsprint. I think the artwork is just absolutely spectacular.
Yeah. Another thing that I come away with, having read Fiction House, your book, is the sheer reverence that you bring to the subject matter, which I have to tell you surprised me a little, not because of you, but because this is a Yoe book publication. Not everything that Craig does, but many of the titles that he puts out, the collections, are fun in one way or another, whether it is finding the more humorous side or the outrageous side of horror comics or romance comics or superhero comics. I mean, there always seems to be, or at least in many of his titles, not all of them, this kind of not really mocking tone, but I guess a humorous undertone, right? Where we're looking at it from more contemporary eyes. But there's really nothing like that in your fiction house book.
Well, tell you, Craig is one of the great humorists that I think I've ever known in my life.
Yeah.
He, for him, comic books are fun, and that's how he looks at them. And so I'd like to talk about him for just a minute, because he's a tremendous coach for me.
Oh, sure. We love Craig on the Comics Alternative. He's been our most frequent guest of all time.
Well, I'll tell you something. He's a remarkable guy. He's a tremendous amount of fun to be around. But I approached him with this. This was really the first thing that I had done in many years. And I approached him with it kind of out of the blue because Roy Thomas had referred me to him. And Craig said, look, he says, he said, we're going to do this as a serious book the way you want to do it. And he coached me on how to cross that line to make it a serious treatment of Fiction House, but at the same time to have some fun with it in terms of what we published. And so much of this, so much of Craig is in this book in terms of his influence on me that it can't be overstated. Same thing with, there were several people that really encouraged me through the creation of this book. Roy Thomas, who I had never met, and I kind of wrote him out of the blue. We're talking about one of the biggest names in comics history, and was, not only was he encouraging to me, but he looked at drafts of chapters and got back to me with notes. He referenced me to, he put me in touch with Trina Robbins, who was another big help. Hames Ware, who created the Who's Who of American Comics, and may have the best eye for art identification of really anybody that I've known, was able to help me identify some artists that were not identified in the Grand Comics database that we've since updated. These people were all tremendously helpful in the process. David Saunders, who's probably the best historian or the most knowledgeable historian of pulp magazines that is out there today, was tremendously helpful on that aspect of writing the history. So, I mean, a book like that, it just doesn't happen by one person. And all of these guys, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some people that I shouldn't, were just tremendously helpful to me in creating it.
Yeah, in your acknowledgments page, you give a tip of the pen to all these people, and specifically Craig and Kletzia for pulling this all together. And they do great production work with all of their texts.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll tell you, Kletzia in particular, a lot of the restoration on this book I did myself because she taught me how to do it.
Huh.
And she took the time to teach me how to do the page restoration, and I would do the work. And, of course, she went in and then made sure that it was, done correctly, and she fixed a lot of things that, weren't great. But she really she helped me add a skill that I didn't have. And, of course, what you see on these pages is Kletzia's work. I helped her with it. And she... but she taught me so much about it, and I do think that that the pages came out quite nicely.
This is something that I really know basically nothing about. I mean, what all goes into page restoration? I mean, what are some of the things that you learned from Kletzia?
Well, the first thing that she taught me was that you have to scan these pages at as high a definition as you possibly can. So we scanned all the pages on this book at a minimum of 400 DPI. Generally, most books that you see are scanned at 300, which is fine for printing. But if you really want to get granular, you want to go with the higher resolution. And then she worked with me on using Photoshop to, take out the dirt, to restore the colors to what they originally looked like, as opposed to making them like reds perfectly red, where to leave defects in that were part of the printing process so that the pages look authentic. She really is a master at all of the subtleties of restoring these pages, and I'm still learning from her right now. She sent very detailed instructions on how to work with individual colors, how to work with color curves, how to work the blacks on the page, and she's remarkably skilled at all of these things, and very generous to be willing to teach it.
Now, how did you come to meet Cletzia and Craig? I think you mentioned a moment ago that Roy Thomas referred you to Craig, but did you know Craig before this?
No, I didn't. I knew of him because I was a huge fan of his Archie Comics celebration.
Yeah.
I'm a huge Bob Montana fan, and I had in my own collection, I have all of the Montana Archie covers. And when I saw that book, I was just blown away by the amount of care that he and Cletzia, and when you look at the Archie book in particular, and you see the raised die-cut cover, and the care that goes into each one of the art rests, that's all Cletzia. She is like the unsung hero, of Yoe Books. I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, he's the vision, and he's the personality, and he's the creative force. But boy, when it comes to production, and it comes to the skills necessary to realize that vision, that's Cletzia, and she's just an amazing lady.
Yeah. Now, Fiction House, this book, From Pulps to Panels, From Jungle to Space, will be coming out toward the end of this month. And then, as I mentioned earlier, your Jungle Girls book comes out right now, as of now, it's April. Are there any other projects that you're working on right now that you feel comfortable sharing with our listeners?
Well, right now, I'm working on putting together a history of Fox. That's one that we're talking about pretty deeply, and I've also completed a Sky Girl compilation.
Oh,
and they're in the works. I'm working with Craig on a couple of his projects, assisting him. I know that Yoe Books is they're working on a Golden Age anti-war anthology. I helped them out with that, and we're working on a science fiction project together.
So, you had mentioned that, I guess, before taking on this Fiction House project, it had been a while since you had done any writing in comics, but now it sounds like you're coming back with a vengeance. Yeah,
well, the way it kind of worked was in the early 80s, I actually did a Star Trek book.
Huh.
And then that was in my 20s. And then, of course, I moved out of that because I was raising a family. And now that I'm retired, decided to go back to writing.
What kind of publicity are you doing for the Fiction House book, if any? I mean, are you going to various conventions, maybe going to speaking engagements?
No, nothing that's been asked about it yet, although I may be doing a signing at Comic Book Jones, which is the largest comic dealer on Staten Island, and has been nominated for an Eisner for the best retailer several years in a row. And so if anybody's listening who happens to be in the Staten Island area, I really urge them to drop in to see Comic Book Jones. Sacco's the guy that runs the place. They have great coffee and a lot of great people over there. As a matter of fact, they had to put up with almost 2 years of lectures on Fiction House, so they should get a reward just for that. And you say you may be doing something there at that location? Yeah, I'm talking to Sacco about doing a signing.
Okay, so you don't know exactly when yet. It's just that our listeners in that area should keep an eye open.
Yeah, just keep an eye open for that. And I would like to say, if we have just a couple of seconds,
Sure.
One of the things that I learned through this process was what a great community this hobby has. From people, from Roy Thomas to Craig, Trina Robbins, all on down the line. Some of these people are comic book legends. And I reached out to them, really out of the blue, and every single one of them was nothing but generous and forthcoming with their own knowledge. And, just from my own life experience, you don't see that in a lot of other industries. So I think that's something that we should take a lot of pride in.
Yeah. I tell you, again, I was very impressed with the finished product. Fiction House, and not only the contents, but also the production value that goes into this. And, we are about to enter the holiday season, so maybe we should mention that this book, Fiction House, would make a good holiday gift.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a great coffee table type of book. It retails at $49.99. It's 300 pages. So I think it's a great value. I'm sure I think Amazon has it for $5 less than that. Mm-hmm. So they're a good place to go for it. And I hope that people will enjoy it. I hope that it will give them a sense that the Golden Age wasn't just about DC and Timely, and that it might encourage them to look more deeply into Fiction House and start collecting some of those great old books themselves.
I agree. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways of the Fiction House book is that when you read what you've written, when you look at the various selections that you include, you come away knowing that there were more bigger kids on the block than just DC and Timely.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, Timely wasn't even, in terms of circulation, wasn't even in the top 5 or 6. I mean, those, at that time, it was DC, it was Fawcett, Dell, Fiction House, and, those were the big guys in terms of circulation. Comic books were, Superman alone was selling well over 1 million copies a month. Mm-hmm. Worldwide, in the hundreds of millions of issues a month. Today, I don't believe that if you combine them all, I don't know that you're doing 1 million copies a month in hard copies. Although comics in general are as popular as they've ever been. Mm-hmm. But at the time, comic books were really, when you think about it, they were the largest form of disposable entertainment you could get.
And Fiction House was a big part of that.
And Fiction House was an absolutely huge part of that. Yeah. I think their legacy is a strong one.
Well, Mitch, I want to thank you again for taking the time and talking with me for the Comics Alternative. Again, our listeners should go out and get the book, Fiction House, From Pulps to Panels, From Jungles to Space.
I appreciate it very much, and it was really a pleasure talking to you, Deb.
Yeah, same here. So there you have it, Paul, my conversation with Mitch Maglio. Once again, I want to thank Mitch for taking the time and being on the Comics Alternative. Also want to thank both Craig Yoe and the good people in the publicity marketing department at IDW for helping to make all this possible.
Yeah, I bet there's going to be folks out there who love this stuff when we get to cover it, love when we get to talk to Craig, love when we get to cover stuff like Fiction House. So people will be interested in checking it out for sure.
Yeah, and I'm also really looking forward to Mitch's book, Jungle Girls, that is going to be coming out in the spring, also from Yoe Books.
They just keep coming.
Yes, they do. You can't slow down Yoe.
The Yoe train.
The Yoe train. And if you want to find great books like this, Yoe Books, and otherwise, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about our interviews. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
If you prefer to leave us an email with some feedback about our interviews, we are always available by email at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. And you can reach out to Derek individually. He's Derek@comicsalternative.com. And if for some reason you want to reach out to me, I'm Paul@comicsalternative.com.
Yeah, and you can reach us all over the social media sphere. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and Slack. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. So until next time, I'm Paul.
And I'm Derek. Thanks for listening.